Welcome to Meet the Prof at Luther. My name's Alan Jorgenson. Thanks for coming to join us today. So I think I should tell you a little bit about myself is the goal, and then I'll talk a little bit about some of my history, some of my experiences at Luther, the courses I teach, some of my intellectual interests, and some time for Q&A at the end as well. So again, my name is Alan Jorgenson. I'm the Assistant Dean at Martin Luther University College. That means I have, in addition to the courses I teach, I have a handful of administrative responsibilities I help out with. So I was actually born in Treaty 6 territory in Alberta. Grew up in Ponoka on a farm just outside of a small town of about 5,000 people at that time. My parents, my mother was actually born in Europe and was an immigrant, came to Canada as a child. My father was a child of immigrants. And when I was growing up, I decided I wanted to be a chemist. I thought the oil industry was booming in those days in Alberta. That seemed like a good choice. So I went and got a diploma in chemical technology, and from there worked at a few places, notably Fort McMurray, and from there to Fort Saskatchewan. In the process of my work, I got connected a little bit more with my church, and a number of people tapped me on the shoulder and said, Alan, you should think about becoming a pastor. And so I eventually thought about it, and I eventually decided I would do that and travel to Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, to the Lutheran Theological Seminary, where I took an MDiv. And in the process of my studies, I had a couple of profs who would tap me on the shoulder and say, Alan, you should think about becoming a theology professor, which was a kind of an interesting thing to happen. And I said, you know, I think I want to try being a pastor before I move on to something more. And so that's what I did. And I traveled, my first call, I'm a Lutheran, so it was in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada. And I traveled to Slave Lake, Alberta. I don't know if you know it, it's in Treaty 8 territory. People think of it as Northern Alberta, although geographically it's more in the center of Alberta. And there I started working with St. Peter's Ecumenical Church. St. Peter's Ecumenical Church was a marvelous church. I have many, many great memories of my time there. My family mostly was born there. I'm married to Gwinan, who works for Habitat for Humanity, and I have 3 daughters, 2 of whom were born in Slave Lake. The other one was born while I was on my internship in Grand Prairie in Northern Alberta. The 2 older daughters are mechanical engineers, and the youngest daughter is just finishing up her master's in geology in Geneva and is about to start a PhD. So they're the light of my life. I'm surrounded by strong women who are my teachers and helpers in many ways in life, help me to see things and to grow as a human being. So Slave Lake has warm memories. It was an ecumenical parish. That meant that there were Anglican, Lutheran, United churches came together to work there. And then in addition to that community, there would be people from other denominations who would come and join. So I learned very early about the importance of being a part of a community that had various interests and perspectives. One thing I also learned while I was serving as a pastor is I really love studying. And so I did a second master's. In those days, it wasn't online. It was more by mail, or sometimes I would have intensive courses at my seminary. So I went and did a second master's there, and decided that, yeah, I'd actually follow on the advice of my professors and applied and became accepted to do a PhD in systematic theology at the Toronto School of Theology. So I picked up my family and we traveled 4,000 kilometers across this great big beautiful country in a U-Haul trailer. It was amazing. And traveled from a community of 5,000 people to a community of 4 million. It was a growing experience, let's say that, but a warm and great experience. While I was there, I continued to do some pastoral work, serving as a part-time pastor in Orillia at a little church called Holy Cross Lutheran. It was a mission church. But my academic work was in systematic theology. So sometimes people ask, what's systematic theology? there's a number of different disciplines, number of different ways you can enter into the theological world. Systematic theology is a particular discipline. I sometimes use the description, it's like the Christian tradition in conversation with culture. So a systematic theologian is somebody who has two intellectual eyes in a way. They're always interested in looking to the past, asking about what has the church learned. The word tradition actually means to pass along. What has the church passed along to us, both for good and for ill? And it's not an uncritical appropriation of the past. But also the other eye is looking at the present context and the future. How does the past inform the future and the present, and how does the present context inform the past? And so I am very interested in something called contextual theology. Contextual theology is a theology very interested in how our current context intersects with our theological claims. And because of that interest, I studied two theologians, one from the 19th century, whose name is Friedrich Schleiermacher, a Reformed theologian, and then a early mid-20th century Roman Catholic scholar whose name is Karl Rahner. Very interested in how they thought about experience as a theological category. So I spent a lot of time thinking about experience. Also, while I was doing this, I worked on Luther, and I've always kept my interest in Luther as a Lutheran. I was raised a Lutheran, have been involved in the Lutheran Church my whole life. So I came to the end of my dissertation, and at that time I had started doing a little bit of part-time teaching at Luther, and took a church in Mannheim, just outside of Kitchener. Lovely group of people there as well. Worked there 4 years, did some part-time teaching as an adjunct at Luther, and eventually ended up getting a job there in 2005 at Luther. So I was very pleased to settle on the Haldeman Tract here in the Kitchener-Waterloo area. And became very involved in the community. And I would say, as I look about my career at Luther over the last 15 years, I realize I've had really two significant learnings that I continue to shape and inform my interest. The first one is I taught a course, I think it must have been about 2008. The name of the course was Theology, Pluralism, and Canadian Contexts. Loved teaching that class. I taught it a number of years, and I'm going to teach it again soon. But in that course, we looked at different Canadian authors and read this book by John Ralston Saul that said, Canada is a Métis nation. And I thought, well, what does this really mean? Canada is a Métis nation. And I learned that Ralston Saul made the claim that Canada is shaped by Indigenous sensibilities in ways that we don't always recognize, and in fact, sometimes we're hostile to. And it got me thinking about what's the Christian relationship to Indigenous worldviews, and what's our history behind it. And of course, we are now knowing more and more about that, but I got started some years ago thinking about that. About 10 years ago, so not too far away from that, first time I taught the course, I was applied and got invited to be a member or a fellow of the AA Arlus Summer Fellowship in Comparative Theology. So I went for 2 summers to a couple of events in the US. Comparative theology is a kind of a way of doing theology in which people are convinced that you don't really know your own theological tradition until you spend a little bit of time exploring that of another. And I was actually discovering this was working for me in terms of Indigenous worldviews and spiritualities, that learning a bit about some Indigenous worldviews and spiritualities helped me to better understand how my Christian faith was similar and how it was different. And I discovered I grew. And increasingly, these two interests of comparative theology enabled me to sort of work together in these in a kind of a synthetic way. My academic interests are around, continue to be around Luther, and I do some work in Schleiermacher. I have a strong interest in comparative theology, and I write around how is theology and how can theology be informed by Indigenous worldviews and insights. So I've got some articles and have a book that's soon to be published in this area. I have strong interests in things like art and poetry. I love running. I love being active. We have a sailboat, so I love spending time on the water. And this COVID thing, one of the things I've picked up on it is I decided I would use this time to learn something new. And so I've taken up yoga. So I'm learning a bit about yoga and learning how to appreciate the body, which I'm bringing into my class. Actually, I want us to think a lot about how the body is an important part of being human that we're sometimes we fail to pay attention to. I love working at Luther. I have great colleagues. The students are marvelous. I love the questions the students bring to the class. It piques my curiosity. I often tell students that at the end of the class, at the end of the semester, I've learned from you, and I say this actually with utter integrity. I really do learn from my students, and I'm so grateful for what every student brings to the classroom. And really, we want to honor that students really do bring something. It's an amazing place, small classes. My style of teaching, I think, is pretty common among the faculty. I don't lecture at people. I'll do short introduction themes, and then we'll have some conversation, some dialogue. We try to do some experiential learning. And I think it's an experience in which we all grow together. It's a great thing. Courses, I often teach Introduction to God and Theological Reflection. That's an introductory course. Jesus and Salvation. So we look at the person of Jesus and the theme of salvation. What does this mean in Christianity and across religious traditions? I just finished teaching the Spirit and Community class. So that's a great course as well. But also I'm mindful that I should really talk a bit about the courses I'll be teaching in this coming year. So I'll be teaching in the fall 530A, God and Theological Reflection. This is a great course. It's a required course in the MA and the MDiv. And it's a course where we ask big questions. How do we understand God? How do we even think about God? What kind of sources do we go to understand God? How do we understand the Bible or other religious texts? And so we spent some time thinking about that. And I try to use some alternate resources too. I want us to be inventive and to be touched by art and by poetry, by narrative, as well as theological resources. We look at those as well. So I'll teach that in the fall, and I'll teach that again in the winter. And in the winter, I'll teach again theology, pluralism, and Canadian contexts. That's a great course. I haven't taught it for a couple of years. I'm really looking forward to teaching it again. And the goal in this course is to take a look at theological motifs across Canada. So we read from coast to coast to coast. We read different voices, Indigenous, settler voices, immigrant voices. We read different genres, some poetry, some novels, some theology, some philosophy, some history. Always asking, what does it mean to be thinking about the deep faith values we hold in the particular contexts in which we find ourselves? So I'm really looking forward to some of these opportunities to engage some of these ideas anew with students who are curious and students who, like me, are interested in going deeper in their understanding of who they are, what this world is in which we live, and how do our deepest held convictions, our beliefs about God, the sacred, about ethics intersect with these. So again, thank you for coming to be with me today to talk a little bit, to think a little bit about what it means to study at Luther. And I'm just going to invite you now, if you have any questions, to make those known, or perhaps if you want, you can also send them to me afterwards at my email, ajorgenson, ajorgenson @luther.wlu.ca. Thanks again.